Hi, scholars. Welcome to Lesson 9 of our history work. Our objectives for today, what we are going to learn about and focus our study on today. We are going to be introduced to France's roles in exploration and colonization, and we will learn about two explorers' travels for France. So, scholars, if you think about it for a moment, right, we have been introduced to the role of Portugal and Spain and England in exploration and colonization. So today we're adding another European country to that list of places for whom we are studying how they got involved in exploring and colonizing. And then a look at two specific explorers for France. So in the early 1500s, Spain was finding gold and silver in Mexico and Peru. Portugal ruled the spice trade in the Indian Ocean. And England, you'll remember, had found excellent fishing when John Cabot went in search of the Northwest Passage and didn't find one. Well, the King of France, Francis I, was not about to let his country get left behind as the other countries were finding ways that they could make money for their kingdoms, for their empires. Similar to Spain and England, the French also explored different countries far from their homeland. In the 1600s, the French were mostly interested in the colonization of North America and the land that is now today Canada, because there were large numbers of furs that they could buy and then later sell in France and around Europe. So the King of France was determined to still work on finding a Northwest Passage, even though England was not able to find it, looking for that Northwest Passage to get to the Spice Islands by going north around North America. So in 1534, he asked Sea Captain Jacques Cartier to explore North America's coast, thinking that there was a way through the continent, right? A waterway, a river, some kind of waterway to get through North America instead of having to go up around it to the north. Well, Cartier first sailed to Newfoundland, where he saw English and Spanish fishing fleets. He also explored the St. Lawrence River and tried to set up French colonies. Scholars, the first time he got to the St. Lawrence River, he thought it was just a large bay and turned around and went back to France. He was sent on a second voyage and went back to that same area and then discovered the St. Lawrence River wasn't just a bay, that it actually was a very long waterway to get to the Great Lakes. So when he worked to set up those French colonies, it was not very successful. No one in France really wanted to go. They weren't all that interested. So King Francis I sent prisoners to the New World. Well, you can imagine the prisoners were very glad to get out of jail, but they were not eager to work to help build a new colony and make it survive. Cartier ended up trying to make the colony work, but when it failed, he gave up and returned to France. Then, scholars, for about the next 60 years, France actually paid very little attention to this land that it had claimed and this area where they tried to set up colonies. Cartier's exploration, along with the travels of some other explorers, led the way to trade with the native people who were already living in that area. The natives were eager to have tools, hatchets, and other metal goods, things that they were not able to make. The French were willing to trade these items because they were eager to have beaver skins, which the native people had. Since these beaver skins, called pelts, were in such high demand in Europe, they were in high demand in Europe, used to make men's top hats like the one you're seeing in this picture. This established the fur trade. The French would take the tools, hatchets, and other metal goods that they had, and they would trade them with the native people to get the beaver pelts that they could then send back to France, have made into these fancy hats that you're seeing, and sell them throughout France and Europe. Many Frenchmen settled in what was called New France so that they could become fur trappers. Native Americans sold great numbers of furs to the French in order to get their metal tools. It was a whole relationship. Beaver pelts were the most popular of the furs that were sold. As you can see on this map, looking at the areas that are blue, New France was quite a large colony in the year 1750. And if you look closely, you will see that Minnesota is included in that blue area. If you know any French, you might even recognize city names like Mille Lacs, Cloquet, Fond du Lac, Le Sueur. Those are all French names. That is because the history of those towns was tied to the French Empire and to the colony of New France. Another interesting tidbit, Minnesota's only national park, we have several state parks, but its only national park is named Voyageurs National Park after the French fur traders, who were called voyageurs, who used to live in the area. And then, scholars, below the picture of the map, there's another little fun fact. Do you know what year Minnesota became a territory? 1849 is correct. And do you know what year Minnesota became a state? You're right, 1858. It probably helped having the answers there, didn't it? On to a second explorer for France. The growth of the fur trade got France interested again in building colonies in the New World, which you'll remember they now were calling New France. This led them to wanting to explore further and to further expand the fur trade. So, in 1682, which was almost 100 years after Cartier had explored and first tried setting up those colonies for France, a French explorer named René Robert Cavelier de La Salle sailed down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. So, scholars, he was right here in what is now Minnesota, traveling from here all the way south on the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. As he sailed that, he claimed all the land that was on both sides of the river for the King of France. This also leads scholars to the establishment of the port city of New Orleans, if you've heard of New Orleans, right where the Mississippi River drains into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, of course, we know that there were Native Americans already living in this area for thousands of years before the French came or before any of the explorers from Europe came to this area. So it's important for us to remember that just because this French explorer said, I claim this land, or this is our land, it does not mean that the Native Americans who were living in this area agreed with them. So, looking at this map, right, before the English, French, and Spanish even arrived in North America, there were already approximately 500 Indian nations living in North America. Take a look at that map. Right, you can see, if you can sort of locate where Minnesota is, right, you'll see the Dakota people, the Ojibwa people were living in this area. The people of the Ojibwa and Dakota Indian nations were at times able to live on friendly terms with the French, but they did lose most of their land to the Europeans who were colonizing the area. Even so, it is important for us to remember that these tribal nations did not entirely disappear, although much of the land was taken from them and they were forced to live on areas called reservations, which we will be studying a little more later in our school year. Today, there are many Indian reservations where Native American people still live and preserve their language and culture. These reservations include White Earth, Red Lake, Leech Lake, Mille Lacs, Fond du Lac, and Grand Portage. Languages spoken in these communities include English and the Ojibwa language. Later in the 1800s, the French Empire grew to be one of the largest in the world when the French took over control of areas in Western Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. So eventually, right, later 1800s, they become quite a powerful empire. But the earlier part of our study, remember, they're working to try to catch up and compete with Portugal, Spain, and England. This is a map of all the areas that were once part of the French Empire. Because the French were in control of these places, there are many countries where French is still spoken today, including, right, France, Belgium, Burundi, Canada, Chad, Ivory Coast, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Djibouti, Equatorial Guinea, Haiti, Madagascar, right, Niger, Rwanda. Right? And I want you to notice that this map is of all these areas that were once a part of the French Empire, both the dark blue and the light blue. So, looking back at what we've learned about today, right, our objectives, what we were working to accomplish. So, we were introduced to France's role in exploring and in colonizing. So, hopefully, scholars, what you're taking away from that is their part in exploring and colonizing, mostly related to wanting to build and have control, remember, monopoly, of the fur trade. And the big thing I'd want you to remember from that is that the fur trade primarily was focused on the beaver skins called pelts that were then used to make top hats, which were quite the thing to have in Europe, right? That showed your wealth, your kind of your status. So having those furs to send back and have made into top hats in France to sell in Europe was a very big deal. And then the second thing we learned about were the two explorers and their travels to France. So we heard about Jacques Cartier, remember, who explored the St. Lawrence River and tried to at first set up a French colony, and it did not turn out to be very successful because the only people they could get to go were prisoners. And those prisoners didn't really want to work on building a colony, right? There's going to be a lot of work into building a new place. That second explorer, right, René Robert Cavelier de La Salle, is best known for sailing down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico and claiming the land on both sides of that river for France. Scholars, that's going to be a very big deal later in our study, how both France and, if you think back to our study of England, they've both made claims on that land area. That's going to be a very big deal later in our study. So, your assignment now is to open that attached Google form, answer those questions about today's lesson. Now remember, you can come back to this video, look at the slides that you're seeing, or re-listen to some of that information from me. Always remember, click submit at the bottom of that Google form. Thanks for joining me for another history lesson, scholars. Our next lesson takes us to one more country in Europe and how it was involved in exploring and colonizing. I look forward to seeing you in a couple days for that next lesson. Thank you.